Huge thanks out to SecularAZ, and thanks for welcoming me. Thanks for a great event we had last night. Secular is one of those words we hear, we use it all the time. We don't often define it. And many might be surprised to discover that throughout American history, from our founding to the Civil War, to the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s, to today, religious people and non-religious people have joined together to say that while religious belief and non-belief is a protected and personal right, our government is not a church. Secular means we choose science over the supernatural. Healthcare decisions should not be constrained by religious assumption. Women have the right to make decisions about their own bodies. Schools should be education first, not ideology first. The United States cannot discriminate based on race, national origin, religion or no religion, sexuality. Tax-exempt churches should have to stand by the same rules and abide by the same regulations as all other nonprofits, and that while the religious have every right to be religious, they are not a party of power and they're not better Americans. I am allies with people like Amanda Tyler at the Baptist Joint Committee. She is founder of Christians Against Christian Nationalism. She and I disagree on theology, but we share values. I stand alongside Rachel Lazar of Americans United for separation of church and state. She is a practicing Jew. We disagree on some theology. We share values. I like the work of Pastor John Pavlovitz. We disagree on theology. We share values. The United States has a church and a state. They are not the same thing. December 1801, the United States had been freshly founded. The American experiment, extraordinary, unlike anything that had been attempted before. Thomas Jefferson was serving as the third president of the United States, of this new nation, when he got a letter that would become part of our history. Now, I was raised in a very Christian nationalist culture. My private Christian schools taught me that the founders were all Christians, and they wanted a Christian nation with Christian laws supporting Christian things. Washington, Madison, Franklin, Jefferson, etc. And so when they conceived of this American experiment, they were supposedly standing on Scripture inspired by God Himself. It made sense to me. Everywhere I looked, I saw God on American stuff. In God we trust on the money, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, elected presidents taking their oath on a Bible. Even in our courts of law, witnesses would be sworn in with, "So help me God." And of course there were the songs, "America, America, God shed His grace on thee." I spent fourth grade in a tiny Christian school, Temple Christian School, that welded students' faith with our notions of the country. Our uniforms were red, white, and blue. The boys wore little clip-on neckties with American flags plastered all over them. We looked like little patriotic paper dolls walking the school hallways. And after we stood and recited our Pledge of Allegiance, we immediately would segue into a recitation of a pledge to the Christian flag and to the Bible. And I can recite those perfectly today because it's welded into my brain. At the age of 10, I was already being tooled up to grow up and restore America's godly glory. I remember whole classrooms of kids singing songs with militarized language. Onward, Christian soldiers marching on to war. The song talked about doing battle against our foes. The cross of Christ is in front of us, one in hope and doctrine. There was just one problem. Almost everything my Christian school taught me about the United States, the founders, the Constitution, was wrong. Oh, if only my history teachers had been someone like Thomas Jefferson. Which brings me back to that letter from 1801. And you're probably well ahead of me because this is an educated group, but take the journey. I think it's appropriate given the occasion. In the late 18th century state of Connecticut, the Danbury Baptist Association was not happy. At the time, Connecticut was different than many other states in that it actually supported a state church, the Congregationalist. They were supported in many ways by taxpayer money. Those who were not Congregationalists were treated like religious minorities. And in the shadow of this state theism favoring one faith in 1790, the Danbury Baptist Association was formed, and they organized to voice their dissent and push back on majority rule. And it was an official letter by the Danbury Baptist that reached the desk of Thomas Jefferson in December of 1801. And that letter included these words: "Our sentiments are uniformly on the side of religious liberty, that religion is at all times and places a matter between God and individuals, that no man ought to suffer in name, person, or effects on account of his religious opinions, and that the legitimate power of civil government extends no further than to punish the man who works ill to his neighbor." And the letter went on to talk about how those who seek after power and gain under the pretense of government and religion would actually be the enemy of religion, law, and good order. So the message they had for the president was pretty much threefold. Congratulations on becoming president. Religion is a private thing, not a public or a national thing. We are worried that Connecticut will play favorites and make everybody who is not a Congregationalist unequal and less free. We are a church that knows Connecticut is not a church. That's what the Danbury Baptists were saying. January 1st, 1802. This response was penned by President Thomas Jefferson, and he assured that Danbury group he took his responsibility seriously, and he said, yes, religion is a personal and not a national thing. Quote, "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state." It's funny, my Christian school never mentioned that Thomas Jefferson, a guy who did admire some aspects of Jesus' teaching as philosophy. That same Jefferson also took a razor blade and he made his own cut and paste Bible with all the supernatural stuff cut out. Moral lessons stayed, miracles got the axe. Because Jefferson believed the magic stuff was in the way, and that Jefferson Bible is on display right now at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Back in 1776, a few months after the writing of the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson borrowed from the English philosopher John Locke when he wrote in his notes, "Neither pagan nor Muslim nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion." Some of Jefferson's contemporaries were scandalized because he owned a copy of the Quran. That little piece of information wasn't in my history books. Now, historians like to argue about Jefferson's personal beliefs. Was he a follower of Jesus in some way? Many biographers, like Christopher Hitchens, believe he was a deist, not a theist, but his personal faith or his lack of faith made no difference as to how the Constitution itself was written, how laws were made, and how courts should rule, how the United States should operate in the face of allies and enemies. Religion and government, two separate things. The Establishment Clause of the Constitution of the First Amendment is not hard to read, it's not hard to understand. Somehow, history revisionists, people like Pseudo-historian and Christian nationalist David Barton have made whole careers out of selling a false Thomas Jefferson. To establish a state church, they need the founders to agree with them. These Christian nationalists are publishing and preaching bogus history. Now, I mentioned Barton. David Barton is a darling of the Christian church, a Christian nationalist, really. He was once named by Time magazine one of the most influential evangelicals in the United States. Churches and Christian schools teach his stuff as history today, even though his degree is from Oral Roberts University. Anybody here know who Oral Roberts is? A faith healer, televangelist, millionaire con artist. He's the guy who once said he had a vision of a 900-foot-tall Jesus who told him to build a hospital, completely oblivious to the irony of being a faith healer who needed a hospital. And from this evangelical indoctrination center, a non-historian became fundamental Christianity's favorite historian, even though what he writes is mostly fiction. He's so problematic, a whole lot of Christians want nothing to do with him. In 2012, David Barton released a book titled The Jefferson Lies, exposing the myths you've always believed about Thomas Jefferson. Aha! Those separation seculars haven't been teaching the real story about Jefferson. He didn't want a secular government. He wanted a Christian nation. The problem is, David Barton's book was so wrong, so filled with nonsense, that his own Christian publisher, Thomas Nelson Publishing, the second biggest publisher of Bibles in this country, pulled his book from the shelves. Their public statement said they had stopped publishing it because it found, quote, basic truths just were not there. We have a word for that. Lies. Lies. Now, Thomas Jefferson was no saint. The founders were flawed men. We know this. Many of them owned slaves. They barred women from government, very much a product of their time. They were humans, not gods. And their histories, their stories are messy. But the American experiment was extraordinary. They were building a nation with no king, no state church, no national dogma, and a wall protecting the church from the government and the government from the church. In his book, The Age of Reason, Thomas Paine said he believed in God, but, quote, all national institutions of churches, whether Jewish, Christian, or Turkish, appear to me no other than human inventions set up to terrify and enslave mankind and monopolize power and profit. George Washington's personal religious beliefs are still debated, but even in his speech to a Hebrew congregation in August of 1790, he said this: all possess a like liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. Benjamin Franklin was a deist. The reason we know, he said so. He had been raised strict Calvinist. He'd become skeptical of the church, but he would also invoke God or a supreme being in his adult life in sometimes confusing ways. Still, he saw ethical behavior beyond any single faith, once advising that people should, quote, imitate Jesus and Socrates. 1796, the U.S. wanted to secure commercial shipping rights and protect our ships on the Mediterranean Sea connected to Tripoli, modern-day Libya. And those waters had been plagued for 300 years by privateers and pirates operating out of North Africa. We needed guarantees of rights and protections on the seas. As a guarantee to that nation that we would not become Christian colonizers in Muslim lands, the famous Treaty of Tripoli, which was signed by John Adams, included these words, quote, the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. John Adams was a Unitarian. He didn't believe in the Trinity. He liked a lot about Christianity, but in a 1799 letter to his wife, he admitted that his belief, quote, excludes superstition. Imagine if this information was taught to every American child and beyond. Imagine if those kids and their parents understood our secular founding and the backstory behind so many of the Christian nation defenses out there. The original motto for the United States, not in God we trust, but e pluribus unum, the Latin, out of many one. In God we trust wasn't on our coins until the time of the Civil War, about a century after the founding. It was added to paper money after a vote of Congress during the Red Scare of the mid-20th century. Under God was not part of Francis Bellamy's original Pledge of Allegiance, which was first written not for the government, but for a local youth magazine in 1892. The words under God added by Congress more than 6 decades later. And by the way, Francis Bellamy, the Christian, was also a socialist. Bellamy didn't think Jesus would be okay with class systems. He believed Jesus would have everybody equal in a socialist model. Teach that at local schools for Christian supremacists and see how that goes over. Teach it to the young, to their parents, to our families, to friends, neighbors, to our elected representatives, to anybody who will listen. America's founders support the right to a personal religion, but they understood the dangers of a national one. I imagine if Thomas Jefferson was here today standing in front of the Arizona State Capitol, if he was watching yet another shade of the Congregationalists who were trying to wield power and discriminate against other people, if he watched Donald Trump on the day Trump suggested in December of 2022 that we might terminate the Constitution, if the man who rebelled against the King of England was shown the February 19th, 2025 image posted on the official White House account showing a crowned King Trump with the caption, "Long live the King," if he read the 900 pages of Project 2025, a detailed roadmap to stripping away the rights of the many and turning us into Gilead, if he was witnessing the absolute horror on the face of free citizens, including many who are devoutly religious and yet understand, along with the rest of us, that a personal God wouldn't need or want a national church. Jefferson's Jesus often preached a philosophy of humanity, charity, kindness, and that Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple. Jefferson's Jesus told rich men to sell their stuff, give it to the poor. That Jesus taught compassion to the least of these. I wonder how both Jefferson and his secular Christ would have seen Donald Trump, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, etc. The Christian nationalist narrative is exclusive by nature. One group ruling the rest, unequal, unconstitutional, un-American. When injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. At this historical moment, the few are trying to steal from the many, to rewrite yesterday, today, and tomorrow in their favor, to betray the founders and to betray we the people. And in this moment, we the people are standing up, speaking out, and pushing back because resistance is our duty. Thank you so very much for having me today.